Hi, I'm Tim Henriques with the Fantasy Book Ranking System, and in today's series we're going to review a really popular book, pretty interesting book, actually a series of two, called The Name of the Wind. Pretty intense books. We have the first one, Name of the Wind, is the series. Actually, the series is the Kingkiller Chronicles, and then the second one is A Wise Man's Fear, done by Patrick Rothfuss. Okay, so this is a review of the first two books, and I'm reviewing them kind of as a whole. I felt like they were both pretty similar, and we get about the same score on each one. If you're not familiar with this system, my goal in this is to help you, the reader, decide if this is a book that you want to read. I'm going to do that by comparing it to different other popular books, so you can say, oh, that's like that, and I like that, or this is missing this characteristic, and that's what I really wanted, so you can make a better decision. Because when you just read on Amazon, everything gets almost the same score, and it's really difficult to tell whether you would agree with the reader in the first place or the reviewer in the first place, what they say. I'm also being a little selfish, and I'm doing this for myself to help understand what makes a really great fantasy novels, what makes them great, because I do hope to kind of dip my toe into those waters at some point, so I'm just trying to understand them a little bit better. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rank them on 15 different categories, usually a scale of 1 to 10. 10 is truly awesome, 8 is pretty solid, 6 not so good, and then we'll kind of go between there. Most books get a little higher score because I pre-screen them by reviewing first, so we're not looking at too many crappy books. I'll also talk about some just elements of the story without a ranking system, but just describing it. And then if there's flaws, strengths, and I'll give my overall impression, and ultimately we'll give one final favor score for the book. So let's get started. First, how epic is the story? Name of the Wind is a pretty epic story, at least in the first two books. Covers a big character change, going through lots of different lands and things like that. So I'd give this a 9. I wouldn't call it quite as sweeping as something like a Game of Thrones story, but it's up there, so a 9 for how epic it is. How well written is it? Well, honestly, this is the standard for well written. So Rothfuss' writing is just brilliant, to put it simply. So this guy would get a 10. He's kind of the judge. Everything else goes up against it. I mean, honestly, it's a little bit like reading poetry, just hundreds and hundreds of pages of it. So the way he describes things, certainly as an aspiring author, I'm envious of his ability. And so it's the quintessential, perfectly written fantasy book. And I'm talking about kind of writing skill. How real did it feel? It feels pretty real. There are some things I thought were just unbelievably real, kind of like the way they do the magic and the whole kind of world was super real. A few other times it seemed a little more far-fetched. This one's a little more of an interesting blend, but overall I'd still give it a 9. Really impressive. I think First Law trilogy is super real, and so that would get up there with a 10. It beats it out a little bit. What lessons are taught in this? Pretty solid, 8.5 lessons. So he's definitely trying to impart certain things. I didn't feel like that was a massive strength of the book compared to some of its other strengths, but I also didn't feel like this was holding it back. So there's definitely some lessons in there for the discerning reader that wants to check it out. Something like Star Wars would get a 10. Is the book a page turner? Yeah, this book is going to kind of keep you up. You know, you're not going to want to put it down. You're going to want to keep reading. You got to kind of find out what's going on, and it is so well written. It's very easy just to kind of, oh, I got to start that next chapter and kind of keep going. So things like Da Vinci Code or Maltese Falcon, I'm going to 10. This one's close, especially for epic fantasy. So 9.5. That's a high mark. How memorable is the story? Given how awesome the story telling is, this is a little bit of the weaker side. I mean, it's memorable, but it's not just unbelievably memorable. I should mention I read this book about 2 years ago, maybe a little bit beyond that. And so, so it's certainly, the bulk of the story is in my memory, but I would have a hard time kind of tracing every element that the main character did. Speaking of the main characters, how memorable are they? This one's going to vary a little bit. Basically the main character's a bard. And so if you think bards are awesome, you're probably looking at that score saying, what are you, an idiot? This guy's my all-time favorite, and you'd put it up at a 10. Personally, I'm a Conan fan, and so, fighters kick the crap out of bards 10 days out of 11. And so I didn't think it was that awesome using that premise as the main character, so that was a little bit of a negative there, so 8.5 for me. How memorable the secondary characters? Again, there's some interesting characters in there, but especially a couple years later, at least for me, given the quality of writing, they just don't stick out, all their attributes, traits. Something like Star Wars, granted, I might have seen it 30 times, but still, certain characters just stand out forever in that. You kind of never forget them. I definitely didn't feel like there was characters I was pretty much never going to forget in this story. How much do you want to read the next book? I want to read the next book. Read the first two. I'm very curious about the story. I want to see what's going on with the author, where he's going to take the story and how he's going to wrap it up. Should have 1 or 2 books left, so 9.5. Something like a Game of Thrones would be a 10. How readable is it? I'm going to give this a 10. I have not read both of those books again, but just given the unbelievable quality of writing that's in there, if you just want to see kind of mastery in prose, then this book's going to be very rereadable for sure. How clear is the good and evil? I felt like the author was trying to say reasonably clear here. It's starting to kind of murky the waters just a tiny bit, but still pretty clear. You kind of knew who you're rooting for, who's evil, and it's not that hard to kind of figure out where we want the story to go. How prevalent is the magic? And so I would say a moderate world. There's like a whole university where you go to and you can kind of learn how to use it, but still most everyday people can't use it. And then among the main characters, several of the main characters can use at least some forms of magic. So moderate on both accounts. Something like Lord of the Rings style. What age is appropriate? This isn't quite as hardcore as something like Game of Thrones, but still there's sex and things like that involved, and swearing and stuff like that. So graphic violence, some language, some sex. So personally I'd say like 15 plus. Also just the way it's written, I don't think the younger reader, I think it would be too deep for them. So you probably want to be a little bit on the older side. But it isn't like so hardcore that you feel like you need to shield people's eyes like some of the Game of Thrones scenes. Is the series finished? No, this is kind of a big negative in my mind. It is not finished, and there's a very big delay time between books coming out. So that's kind of frustrating, especially when the readers are on the edge of the seat wanting to know what's going on. What flaws did it have? Well, I already told you, in my mind, the main character is a bard. I mean, he's about as cool of a bard as you can be, but he's still a bard, and so that's not what I kind of, wake up and just dream about reading. You might be different. I didn't find the secondary characters were that memorable. The main character's name, Kavoth, right, or however the hell you say it, even online, you're going to find people arguing 10 ways to Sunday about how to say it. Maybe that's a strength. I personally think it's a weakness. Something that's a little hardcore on him, but the guy writes so brilliantly that some of the brilliant metaphors all blend together. So if he gives you a brilliant metaphor about, just passing, an hour on a bench versus some sort of epic fight, it's not, they blend together. He almost needs to save some of the super, super brilliant writing to really highlight the super key scenes. And he took kind of a different approach. He didn't want to be like the same thing again, like with a bard. Has a super cool kind of realistic world feel, but some things, like there's a dragon in there, which is cool because it's interesting and new, but it's like a pretty big letdown. You're like, wait a minute, you could have done this. I don't even know if I like the main character. Part of me wants him to be like, a loser, and then part of me is kind of rooting to find out what happened. And so, and again, there is a massive timeline between the books, which is kind of frustrating. My overall impression, I've already mentioned, is incredibly well written, so he deserves unbelievably high marks for that. The world itself and the way he kind of like puts the magic, certainly it's the most real feeling magic. You feel like if you just do the steps, you yourself would be able to do it. That's pretty awesome. The system of magic's logical and awesomely created, and the world felt super real, although the characters didn't always feel super real. It is definitely fantasy written for the adult, and so it is annoying. For example, it took 4 years after the second book, and now after the third book, there's not even a release date for when the third book's supposed to come out, and it's been 5 years already. So it's like, come on, obviously these are big books, it's hard to do, but get with it, write it. Having said that, a lot of people would rank this as their favorite fantasy series of all time. So I certainly want to acknowledge that and represent it. And I just got to be honest with you, like, what I'm most bitter about is you got an author with this level of skill. People always say, oh, don't write the same fantasy, because they don't want the same B-level author writing about a knight who faces a dragon. When you have an author who is unbelievably skilled, go ahead and write the classic story and make it the greatest. I'm like, this guy could have written about a dragon with scales and breathing fire, and instead it's some six-legged bull, and it's like, come on, what are you doing? Like, you could have made this so awesome. So again, it's his story. He's got to go. But had he chosen to kind of rewrite Lord of the Rings basically in a cool story in a similar setting, that would have just been super awesome in my opinion. So what would I give this? Well, ultimately it gets an incomplete because it isn't done. To me, a series of books is like a picture, and it's great that you've painted a third or two-thirds of a picture and it looks freaking awesome, but I can't give it due justice until it's all the way done. If the third book matches the first two, then I'm going to give it very high marks, 93. This does rank second on our all-time incompleted fantasy series list, so 93 is definitely up there. And again, the quality of writing is super high. And if you've always wished that someone would write about a bard as the main character, well, you're probably looking at that and thinking that should be a lot higher. But that's where I give it. So, Name of the Wind, pretty awesome story. Very interested in seeing what happens in the next one. But a couple of flaws that do bring it down, and to me, definitely not the best fantasy series out there.